The topic that we have before us today is the literature of resistance. Now, this is an open-ended topic, and amongst the things that we will discuss is what in fact is the literature of resistance before we get on to the specifics of the matter. But prior to all of that, we have a 5-minute video message, especially for the Lahore Literary Festival, from Arundhati Roy, who is sent from India, and
he's been muffled.
Go back okay, so now what is but can you get I think she's coming.
fix this shortly. Will we fix it shortly? Thank you.
No. Wrongly.
I think in the interest of the efficient use of time, we will perhaps end with Arundhati Roy's message. And so now, panelists, if I may, when I was offered this panel and I was told that you were all going to be discussing the literature of resistance, the first thing I thought was, what does that mean? What is the literature of resistance? Are we talking about polemical tracts? Are we talking about myth-making that goes into any political struggle? Are we talking about ideological tracts? Are we increasingly about the use of social media and poetry therein? I would be very interested actually for us, for the benefit of the audience and for clarity, to have some idea of what all of you respectively understand by the literature of resistance. And I think we have a very interesting panel because we actually have someone from Kashmir, a Palestinian writer, Mohammed, who is of course a man of many places as we know, but has been working on Balochistan, and Lyse, who's been covering the Arab Spring. And so I think let us begin with the greatest outsider's perspective, the most removed perspective, and perhaps therefore the least imbued with emotion. Lyse, what do you understand by the literature of resistance?
Thank you very much, and first of all I should say it's an absolute privilege and a pleasure to be here with all of you at the first shout out to the people, the great people of the great city of Lahore. Let me just make a few comments on what we've been seeing and hearing in the Middle East and North Africa, because something absolutely extraordinary happened there. That after decades, and in some ways after centuries, of a region not producing very much, not saying very much, suddenly it wasn't just even about resistance. It was about revolutions, about uprisings. And it wasn't just about changing countries' histories, a region's histories. It actually captured the imagination of the entire world. And I know I came to Pakistan when the so-called Arab Spring had kicked off, and people here were asking me about it. You go now through Cairo International Airport, and there's these huge billboards with the German president saying the people of Egypt deserve a Nobel Peace Prize for standing up. And Barack Obama saying on this billboard, at least at a certain point in time, he said, all American children should be educated like Egyptian children. And what was one of the most extraordinary things about that period, which I think is relevant to this kind of a festival, is that among all the rallying cries, and you heard, and I'm sure you've heard and seen them about Kura, which means freedom, or Karama, which means dignity, one of the most extraordinary ones was, we have lost our fear. And for those, I mean, here in Pakistan, you've known that sense of fear, military dictatorship, at times of great censorship. And in the Middle East and North Africa, we saw it. We didn't just see it on, of course, the bravely confronting the tanks on the streets, bravely and boldly picking up the tear gas canisters and throwing them back, but also, for the first time, in a way that had never happened in the lifetime of so many people, was actually not just speaking, but speaking out. And I think for decades, there will be what Hamid Haroon talked about earlier today, about the value of hindsight, about trying to understand what really happened. How did this extraordinary series of events begin? We've all heard about the fruit and vegetable seller, Mohammed Bouazizi in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia. I went there not long after he died, and I met his mother. And she was a mother like, any Pakistani mother. She goes, my son, he was a good boy. He really just wanted to get a job. But instead, when he set himself alight, he set an entire region on fire. Wasn't, as has been said in the media, a Facebook revolution, a Twitter revolution? Sometimes I think that falls into the category that journalists don't like to admit is the story that's too good to check. Because everyone wants to believe that it was the power of social media. But of course, history is never so simple, and of course it did play a part. But some of the most important days in Egypt, in Cairo, was when the internet was shut off. So people were forced to leave their computers and go out into the streets. And others, now looking back at that period, say, well, actually, we did see the stirrings of resistance, if you want to call it, of people getting bolder. In places like Egypt, for example, a decade before the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring started, you had the extraordinary novel by Ala al-Aswani, The Yaqubian Building. And ironically, Ala al-Aswani is a dentist. And Prince Hasan of Jordan always said, the only time that Arabs open their mouth is when they go to the dentist. And here you had a dentist writing about, and writing in the way that I think a lot of writers across that region had been forced to write for so many years, which is by the use of metaphor, of allegory, of using subtle literary techniques to tell or to make some very trenchant criticism. And for those of you who've read the book, The Yaqubian Building is a metaphor for Egyptian society, about a corrupt and undemocratic state, about a disenchanted, restive population. He broke taboos in talking about homosexuality. He was using metaphors in order to do that. And I think just, the last thing I'll say is that if there is a literature of resistance across the Middle East and North Africa, for centuries it has been, there's been some choices for writers. Either you were part of the propaganda machine, you gave in, or you didn't give in and you went to prison, or you used these different techniques, using the historical novel, using the past to criticize the present, using genres like magic realism, as it's called, or science fiction. And so what's happening now with not just bringing down of systems of censorship, but bringing down the walls in people's minds, because that is an extraordinary part. And again, people losing their fear, is people feeling for the first time they can speak out. And the last thing I'll say is just, how do we put ourselves in the shoes of people who have not been able to speak? In Tunisia, for example, these very simple but very profound stories. And when you take about people writing on Facebook, how one was almost person by person, they'd open up their Facebook and suddenly they'd see someone put dégage, get out. And you could have gone to prison for that under Zinedine Ben Ali's rule, but suddenly people were saying that, and you think, well, if that person has written that, and he's not in prison, maybe it's okay for me to write that. And it just started and started until it was dozens of brave activists, then it was hundreds, then it was thousands, then they left their computers and they went out into the streets. And being in Tunis in January of 2011, after Ben Ali went, was a time that I will never forget, because suddenly this elegant Parisian boulevard, Habib Boulevard Avenue, had been transformed into, we said, a series of Hyde Park corners where people were discussing and debating in groups. And they would come up to you. You couldn't walk down the street. People would come up to you and say, sorry, I've never been able to talk like this before. Let me tell you what I think. And then midway through the conversation, they would stop in amazement and realizing that for the first time in their life, they'd been able to speak out. And so I guess what I would only say is that, here we are at the Lahore Literary Festival, celebrating, freedom of expression in terms of art and music and media, is to spare a thought for those who don't even have or haven't had that most simple of freedoms of being able to speak, and more importantly, the feeling of being able to speak. Thank you.
I think Lyse has raised some very interesting points, and I think the principal thing that comes across is that, one person's literature is another person's propaganda, and where do you draw the line? What is literary? Is it just the written word that we are talking about? The written word can be an agent for change, but it can be an agent for good change or bad change. And I think that it would be useful, Hanif, if you could dwell on your experiences in Balochistan and documentation, which is what you've done. And do you think that that serves a purpose? Does it serve anything more than an archival purpose? Does it serve as a awareness tool? Or is it like much of the criticism of literature goes, that this is a medium that speaks to the converted? It's preaching to the converted. I'd like you to please dwell on that.
Thanks, Hanif. Can you work? Is this working?
No.
Can you hear me? Yeah. It's not working. Is it now? Yeah. Is it working now? Yes, it is. Okay. Yeah, just to add a point to sort of this brilliant introduction about Tunisia, and all these people were kind of sitting there putting all this wonderful stuff on Facebook, but not very many were coming out. It was only when the government shut down the internet, and then they didn't have any Facebook to go to, that's when they came out on the street. So sometimes things can work that way as well. I'm one of those hopeless people who think that politics is the only real art, and rest is all a propaganda. Everything, sort of. I read it on a T-shirt once, and that's where I think in our context, some few sort of read Urdu newspapers, you might find these stories which kind of, and there's usually kind of one column, like, sort of 2-inch story, usually sort of buried kind of in the inner pages. And they usually kind of go like, कि नामालूम अफराद ने उसी नामालूम अफराद को उठा के उसको फिर किसी नामालूम जगह पे ले गए, उसके साथ कुछ नामालूम फेल जो है उसके आगे. And that's considered like a sort of an accepted journalistic practice. So I have worked as a journalist long enough, and I've kind of begun to realize at this stage that the most basic form of resistance in our society is to name names. That these people are not namalum people, they have names. They kind of, live in a house. They have, sort of brothers and sisters and families. And similarly, the people who take them away, those namalum afraad, they also have a kind of, sort of, sometimes they have ranks, sometimes they have, sort of other ranks. Sometimes they take on kind of, names that are not their own names, so it's very difficult to sometimes identify them. But sometimes we clearly know that who these people are and where these people have been taken. So I kind of increasingly think that that is the most basic form of resistance in our society. Because for years and years, I mean, I was in high school when the first Shia doctor was killed in Okada, where I was kind of, studying in high school. And it was relatively kind of new phenomena. And so, you can expect that it wasn't mentioned that the doctor who was killed was Shia, or the fact that people who killed him, sort of have a couple of mosques here. But this has gone on for 30 years now. I think it's only after, sort of having killed thousands that you finally able to kind of say that, oh, those 100 people who died yesterday, actually they were Shia. And now, then we have people in our society, and they claim that this is their sole aim in life, to kill Shias. I mean, they're not kind of, they're not shy about it. It says in their literature, they say it every day in their speeches, and we somehow, especially people in the media, and that's how kind of other people kind of know that what's going on in society, and we refuse to name them. Even when they're sitting there in the middle of your city, thumping their chest, saying that we've been doing this for 30 years, and we will keep doing it unless like all of them are kind of dead or leave the country. So that I think is quite a disturbing attitude. And some of you might remember that not this one, but when the last attack happened on Hazaras, the very next day, a gentleman called Malik Ishaq was giving an address in Karachi, and he said, and these are his words, and I quote. He said, he started his speech and he said कि आप लोगों को पता है मुझे तकरीर इतनी अच्छी नहीं करनी आती, लेकिन आप लोगों को ये भी पता है कि मुझे कौन सा काम बहुत अच्छी तरह आता है. And everybody wrote, everybody kind of, and we again, sometimes I get invited on TV talk shows, and as soon as you mention a name, either you're cut off, or it's made sure that you're not called in for like next 3 months. Or you're called like on some subject that you come and talk about literary festivals or something. And that is my final point. I don't know. Yes, literature, any kind of literature is a form of resistance. I think even the most rabid right-wing literature that our bookshops are full of, I think that's a form of resistance. That's coming from another side, which we don't agree with. But I was just wondering, kind of not listening to Arundhati Roy's kind of saying, and I was just wondering, we've kind of somehow begun to think that literary festivals are a form of resistance as well. I mean, they're very good for writers because otherwise we'll have no social life. But I don't really know if it was a form of resistance, then Arundhati Roy would be at every literary festival. But she doesn't go. She just sends these video messages, which is nice because she knows what is important, what is not. We did that session, you were there in Karachi Literary Festival, about these Baloch missing people, and some of their families were there. It was a kind of a very scary moment, and I was very nervous, but sort of they said whatever they had to say, everybody talked, everybody went home. And later that night, I was thinking, and some of these families were there at the festival speaking, I was thinking that these people have been demanding their brother back, like for 4 years, in some cases for 10 years. And what we are willing to offer them in return is an appearance at a literary festival. That's made me very, very sad.
Thank you, Hanif, for pointing out that the written word or speaking about the written word is not a substitute for action. Which brings us very nicely to Dabbagh, who is a Palestinian writer and who's written a novel, a highly acclaimed novel about the Gaza Strip. Seima, you have, of course, this is one of the most famous struggles in the world, and it is a struggle that has benefited and suffered at the hands of a lot of myth-making and counter-myth-making. Where do you see yourself in this exercise, and what do you think the role of a writer is, or a novelist is, in that sort of situation? Can a novelist actually even bring creative integrity to so fraught a terrain? Or do you just end up, whether you like it or not, positioning yourself on one side of a debate?
Well, thank you for the question, because it really brings up a lot of things I debated about a lot whilst writing my novel. I'm not just Palestinian, I'm also half English, so I'm a bit of an outsider, which makes my role a lot more tenuous and a lot more fraught with difficulties of of a moral and a political and a soul-searching kind. And I came to literature after a career in law and human rights work, which I became increasingly frustrated with, because you would produce these amazing, factually, verified reports, which you would go to London with and would present, and you'd look out at the audience, and it was all the people that you demonstrated with on Saturday, and your friends and your parents. And you couldn't really break out of the groups who were already interested. So what I felt with the novel is that this is a form, because I was always an avid reader and always wanted to write fiction, that I felt that this is a form that can actually transport me to countries that I know nothing about. And then through this entry point, I become more curious about other issues, and I start reading non-fictional works from these countries. So, for example, Guatemala opened up to me through a novel called The Long Night of White Chickens, etc. So this was a feeling I had when I made the shift to literature, was that I could get across to the incurious about an issue. But you have, when you write, your arrogance and your self-doubt, you're constantly dealing with these huge emotions about whether what you will do will have an impact, or if it has an impact, whether it will have the wrong impact, particularly with something so fraught and so full of misrepresentation, such as the Palestinian case. And I think it really, for me, I had to sort of set myself my own little tests as to what I needed to do in order to make myself true to my work, but make sure it wasn't irresponsible. You cannot try to present something which is following a party line. You cannot suppress all internal faults. And so I had these kind of tests, one which was a sensitivity in terms of proximity to subject matter and to creating a world which had been real to me, which I wanted to make real to others, and the types of characters who I saw so much strength in, because I felt that if I could export them and to convey them and to make people live in their skins, that it would bring a sort of freshness of approach to which the media headlines often deaden, to humanise them in a very vibrant way. And the other was sensitivity, and the other was responsibility, which weighed heavily upon me, because you are so open to being misrepresented. And I think that can sometimes create perhaps a more cautious work than if you're writing about a less fraught situation. Each writer has to have their own tests, and it depends not just on what they're writing about, but when they're writing, because I think that you can sometimes at the beginning part of a revolution, just leading up to it, or an uprising or a revolt, you have a flurry of artistic activity, and probably in the early sort of honeymoon days, again, this is all great, and consciousness building, and everyone feels a collective spirit and they're uplifted by this work. And then afterwards, I know it's more problematic, but it's much harder for writers to work because they've got problems on their side as well as on the other side, and it's not just a case of, it's harder to have a role which is true to yourself. And I think, with Palestinian literature, a lot of it is very great and good, but a lot of what has been translated into English doesn't quite manage to get away from this desire to tell the whole narrative, the whole story, to explain it, because the feeling is that if people understood the whole story, what's happening would not continue.
And that allows us to segue into Kashmir. Kashmir, of course, is dear to our hearts, whether we like it or not. And as we were discussing earlier, the relationship between literature, politics, and propaganda. Certainly, most of us in this audience have, and I exaggerate not, seen perhaps in our lifetimes 10,000 news reports on PTV, on Kashmir. We do have that kind of background, if you will. But Basharat brings a very interesting perspective as someone actually who experienced and lived the conflict and who covered it in non-fiction. And I think that what Seima was describing were many of the problems and the crises of a writer writing fiction. Basharat, would you be able to write fiction the way you wrote about Kashmir?
I wish I had the challenge of Mohammed. There doesn't seem to be... Hello? Yeah. So, yes, I would like to write fiction, but I think I have no imagination. And beyond that, when I was trying to write my first book, and I don't think I even thought about fiction. I do read fiction in a serious way, as all writers have to. But I think in some ways there's a certain kind of writing, whether we look at various Palestinian accounts or various Jewish accounts, or whether we look at several Russian writers like Dabbagh, for instance, or even Montauk closer home. There's some things which I felt I couldn't really build a fictional world, because what was real, it was just so pressing. I couldn't call that person something else. I couldn't want to create a composite character, because the intensity of that reality, at times you just need to write it the way it is to be able to live. And I am a professional writer, and there are various things that I, apart from Kashmir, but I don't think I could have done without doing it. There are books and there are things that you have to, that are necessary, and not just because you're in a particular profession, but they're necessary for your own being. It's a story all of us have, sort of, my friends, my generation in Kashmir, and that's all we talked about. I went to college in Delhi. I'd never been to North India before, and they were very strange people to me. They wore different clothes, the language was different, the culture was very, very different. And that was also the first time I met a lot of young Kashmiri people from everywhere. And the only thing that we talked about was what happened in Europe. And that's true. That was towards the end of college. I sort of knew that I want to be a writer and write about it. But I never felt the need to fictionalize anything. Of course, there are things you can do in fiction you might not be able to do in non-fiction. But you also have to look at it as it's a particular story, in the sense that we did not have many books on Kashmir written by Kashmiris. There were all kinds of people who come in from Delhi and New York and elsewhere and tell their accounts. In some ways, I was also writing against a lot of the writing that had been done. To look at Kashmir from Kashmir, to look at the world out. It was a book I wasn't writing for my, for the people in my town, in my city. It was a response to everything, it was a response to your PTV headlines too. I too got them, we get PTV and Durations both. It's the worst of both the worlds. Yes, I'm thinking, since we are talking about literature of resistance, I don't know whether it changes anything, but it lets you live.
Doesn't change anything, but it lets you live. And then there are those whose lives you're telling who don't get to live. It's a Faustian bargain. It's almost, I certainly find, as a documenter of human rights violations, that there is a sense of unease, of dis-ease, almost of guilt as you are engaging in this exercise, because at some level it seems voyeuristic, because it is not your suffering, and in the process of presenting this person, are you humanizing them or are you objectifying them? Exactly what Hanif was saying. When you bring them to a literary festival, when you take them to a TV show, when you organize a seminar with these people, what exactly is it that you are doing, particularly to an audience which is not, as you said, Seima, of the initiated. It is an audience that comes in and that is going to view perhaps these people as exhibit A, B, C, and D. I'm not sure how one squares the circle about any of this, but the question then is, can one actually bring, in the process of highlighting the suffering and these lives, are you making them real, or are you dehumanizing them? Are you turning them into caricatures? I mean, these are unpopular questions, and certainly questions that writers do not like to ask themselves. Neither do human rights activists, by the way. So let's all engage in a little bit of self-loathing, and I would be more than happy, please, if you would converse rather than you know, do this.
It's a brilliant question, which we would expect from you, but unfortunately, if the answer is that we should feel guilty, or that there's not much consequence in writing about things and hearing about things, then we may as well all just pack up and go home. Yeah. Because all of us here today, one way or another, are part of this business. And I think I would emphasize what Hamid Haroon so eloquently said this morning in his tour de force through Pakistani culture, history, and politics, is that everyone has a right to know the truth. And most of all, the young, who are the future, have a right to know the truth. And if we believe that in democracy, information, knowledge is power, then the fact that there is Human Rights Watch, the fact that there are novels who reach out to audiences who don't read Human Rights Watch, it may not change the situation, but if it changes the mind of even a few people in the audience, then I think it's not for naught. I mean, I do agree with Mohammed that the best and really the only form of resistance is actually resistance itself, and not just writing about the resistance. But I think changing people's minds is a very complex process, and I think the process of speaking out about it and being seen to speak out about it is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's so, you feel this huge burden that you should be doing everything, and really you can do very little. I mean, I've had people saying to me, is the third intifada an intifada of art and writers? And it's like, come on, you know, we really can't do anything very much on our own. I mean, it has to be part of the process. And I did, you know, start by saying that, you know, part of my ambition with my book was to present Palestine to the, you know, sort of people who didn't understand it. And you work with so many competing ideas about who you're writing for, and why you're writing, and how you're going to write it. Because it was such a long process writing this book. I mean, you're going through, you know, so many different sort of genesis of your development, particularly with a debut book. And I then, you know, got to a point where I really just felt that if all I'm doing is writing this for 5 people who are close to me, who've been through this with me and understand this like me, and it gives them some comfort about these weird situations we sometimes get in, you know, whether it's Palestinians being in London and having, you know, being kind of having everyone raise their eyebrows because they're getting far too agitated at dinner parties, or whether it's, you know, what you're going to be doing at home. I mean, I can't I don't know that a novel now is going to lead people to go out into the streets in the way that maybe a Twitter storm might. But, you know, it's part of a sort of sense that I think of it more of a building of internal resistance. You know who you are, you know where you're from, you know other people who are, you know, suffering the ways you do. And it's a part, you know, it's sort of self-consolation and comfort to others who are in those strange, you know, strange.
I think a lot of it has to do with the stuff, your context, where you are. I was teaching at Berkeley University last year, and there were 10 students. I was doing a creative writing workshop. As it happens, they were all girls, and I asked where are the boys. They said, hey, we used to fight first, and now they're all studying computer skills. So, the brightest of them, Lina, I still remember her name, she used to, you know, sort of write brilliant stuff, like one of those gifted people, you know. She would just like give her an assignment, like, you know, within half an hour, she'd you know, sort of turn up with a brilliant piece of fiction. But since then, I've been following her, and she's kind of hasn't written any fiction at all. She's very active on all the kind of, you know, websites. She writes for Al Jazeera. She writes brilliantly. But and I've asked her a couple of times. She said, "There's no way that I can, you know, sort of take even a day off and sit at like my desk and think about, like, you know, something that would, you know, sort of fascinate me enough." So sometimes people do get kind of, you know, caught up in whatever is, as Basharat said, whatever is happening around them. That even if they wanted to, they can't. But the question that you asked earlier, I did really think about it, especially in this with this Baloch missing people. But this was a very specific context, because these people have been coming to Lahore, outside Press Club 3 months, Islamabad 3 months, Karachi 3 months. So there's like, you know, sort of a young educated girl who's sitting there every day in the protest time. What does she want? He wants a brother back. Before that can happen, what does she want? She wants you guys, press, to pay any attention. Do we pay any attention? No. So I didn't have that problem. I said they want to talk to people, so I'll talk to them and I'll try and see if there are other people who are willing to talk to them. So that wasn't very complicated. But the other thing that you said, that do you kind of objectify them? I mean, are you being voyeuristic? And I used to ask when I would sit and chat with them and listen to these horrible stories, what exactly is it that I'm interested in? And it occurred to me one day, I had this horrible thought. Basically, actually, I'm interested in torture. Because even in my novels, I think there's these random torture scenes. So I said, maybe I'm just educating myself on the latest torture techniques. And that was a horrifying thought. You kind of, you know, doubt yourself, you question yourself. I don't think I learned much in the process.
I mean, this question about objectifying and bringing, it's a question of religion, really. You know, I have disappearance. When I hear about Balochistan, it's like home. You know, we do the same story, and I think you change names and new text, and it will work exactly like Kashmir. But you know, I mean, I remember the first time I actually saw there's a woman back called Parveena Hanif. There's an association of persons, of parents of disappeared persons, 8,000 disappearances. I remember as a, you know, 2001, 2 maybe, I was working as a journalist in Delhi, and I saw her at one of the major social sciences institutes. Some activists had invited them to give a talk. And, you know, there's this woman who's come out of her context from a small place to the big city, which is actually hostile to her. And there's some people who are sympathetic and trying to give her a space. But I was very troubled by it, and it really disturbed me. I mean, I did at that moment feel that it is a degree of kind of objectification, that, you know, maybe we should go to her, like listen to her in her own context and tell her story, and rather than have push them into an unfamiliar setting where, you know, there is a lot of social awkwardness. I mean, I remember saying, I mean, she spoke very halting Urdu or Hindi. You have a cultural elite of a certain society. There is a power dynamics, and it's uncomfortable, it's difficult. But I think, I mean, those are things, but still at the end of the day, 5 people out of that certain gathering will Indian cultural elite went ahead and wrote op-eds. It did count for something, but I think there is a great degree of, I think we even as writers or whether it's a public event, I mean, we have to, I mean, that degree of respect and being conscious of the fact of the class and the power dynamic there is something very, very important in such situations. I mean, at times if we are patronizing when it comes to writing or interaction with a person who's survived a calamity or that kind of injustice, we are no worse than the perpetrators. I mean, and that is a challenge we have to do.
I remember when I wrote my first journalistic piece, I was in Karachi, and obviously all the stories even back then were about violence. So it was like, you know, piece about kind of this violence. It had some really graphic pictures of some dead women in it. And my mother, who couldn't read or write, so I kind of took the magazine to her just to kind of show off that now I have a job, and she was kind of went through it. And she was really genuinely surprised. She said, can you actually make a living printing dead women's pictures? What kind of job is that? So I always kind of remember that what you're doing is it kind of, you know, what exactly it is that you're trying to do?
As a novelist, you said something very interesting earlier. You said that basically it's all politics for it to have meaning. Now, the point is that, and this takes me back to the title of our talk, which is literature resistance. What makes something literary? Does it have to be political? Can there be something that is of great literary or linguistic merit, which is devoid of politics? Is there? I ask. I put this out because I think that this is a question that deserves an answer, because normally what we do is that either we are in sympathy with the politics of a writer, or we are not in sympathy with the politics of a writer. And if a writer says to you that, well, I wish to depict to you the physicality of the world without seeking to judge it, which I think is a rather difficult thing to pull off, let us say, that they do, judgment-free writing. Are you suggesting that, therefore, that judgment-free writing, where there isn't even an implicit judgment, is of no consequence and of no value, regardless of the beauty of its construction? I would like all of you to address this, because I think that there is this perpetual struggle between the idea of basically about what constitutes meaning, and I think that particularly for the novelist, there is room to explore this. Certainly, if you're writing non-fiction, you are writing about specific things. If you're reporting about specific things. But actually, as a novelist, you can conjure up a world that says nothing at all necessarily about your contemporary reality or where you're coming from. Or am I wrong? I mean, generally that I'm just being foolish. That's also fine.
I mean, there are people, you know, you can argue that everything's political and that, you know, that can be made the case. You could look at some texts and say that they are, you know, devoid of political content. I mean, I think, you know, the key test as to whether a piece of fiction works for me is that it, you know, emotionally communicates, that you're somehow able to convey a reality across, a fictive state across. With regards to the question about objectifying, sorry, to go back a bit, I think, you know, there's such often the people you're dealing with are either unseen or so objectified or demonized that really you probably can be very oversensitive about this issue about, you know, whether you're possibly running a risk. But I think that if there's enough sensitivity within the individual writer, you can deal with it. But it's each writer's own assessment. But would you like to
It's an interesting question about in trying to define what is resistance, and then focusing on the question of what is political, because I think we live in a world where so much that is personal is political, because we live in societies where the state is so much involved in so many aspects of our life. So now someone's sexuality is political because it's about their personal freedom, someone's religion, someone's desire to live on one piece of land rather than on another piece of land. So it's sometimes very hard to define like what is your personal private space and what is the domain of more conventional political space. And I think of what Seima was talking about, the plight of the Palestinian artist or writer. And I remember, in Palestine when I lived there in the 90s, how some of the artists wanted to do still lifes, bowls, fruit, and people would come and say, "Well, what's this about?" And they'd say, "It's art." And they'd say, "But it doesn't have anything to do with the Israeli occupation." And the artist would say, "I don't want to write about the Israeli occupation. I just want to do still life." And they were made to feel that this was of no consequence. And I think this brings us back to your earlier point that you started off with, Ali, about, and this is the danger about resistance and writing and Human Rights Watch reports, is that the resistance can actually be appropriated to be part of the propaganda. So that in some societies it's a safety valve. The regime lets it, let them talk about it, we all feel good about it, and we don't have to do anything about it. And we saw this, just one last point, about in Palestine, because an absolutely seminal moment in terms of the literature across the Middle East was the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the partition of historic Palestine, because it gave rise to what was called the literature of political commitment. And people who had authoritarian regimes wanted their writers to talk about Israel and dispossession and occupation, rather than talking about the fact that they were living in very, very undemocratic societies. And they appropriated the Palestinian narrative instead of doing something about it. So there are the dangers, as you rightly pointed out, in the resistance and literature of resistance in terms of who uses it and how it is to be used, and whether it becomes, as Mohammed said, a substitute for action. Anyway, something I said about you.
I was just, this struck me about the fruit and the still life.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of Palestinians would say that is a very political act. I mean, look at
Yes,
all the orchards they've lost. With my own eyes, I've seen like these fruit trees where settlers have poured acid on them. So for the next 20 years, you forget that tree. So somebody would say, yeah, sitting home and painting a still life of a fruit is a political act. What was this?
Never mind.
Yeah, I mean, we can go on and on about it, but you can say that, for example, our kind of mainstream TV drama, it occurred to me because they're sitting there, so it just occurred to me. One of Pakistan's most popular writers these days is a young woman called Mohammed, who writes novels and writes TV plays, and you watch them, and they are very, very political. Somebody might say, but these are family stories. But then family is the place where kind of, bitterest kind of politics happens the most. Always somebody kind of giving somebody a sermon. And I watched like one of the recent episodes, and I kind of knew the director, and I said, I mean, this is brilliant stuff, because आप ड्रामा भी देख रहे हो और आपको ऐसे भी लगता है कि सवाब भी हो रहा है साथ साथ. Large family kind of, stuff going on, but it is, I think it is all very political. And now I have to ask Mara to come to this literary festival. She won't, because she's a real writer. She's all
Well, thank you very much. Alright, well, I was told that the time is up, but according to my watch, it's 10 to. It is 10 to, so we have now 10 minutes, and I think it is now time to open this up to questions. So, I would welcome questions from the audience if there is anyone.
Hello?
This gentleman where right there.
Excuse me? Hello?
Oh, mine is with you. Okay.
Right, so my question was, it is actually said that at the time of repression, you have the best form of literature or art. Now, how true would that be?
Repression. That repression breeds good art. Yes, no, maybe.
Who would ever suggest that repression? never want to sit here and make an argument that repression is a good thing. But you have seen that countries that have come out of periods of more authoritarian rule, like for example, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian writers, the refuseniks and the dissidents suddenly found it wasn't as exciting to be a writer anymore because you didn't really have something to take on, something to inspire you, something to drive you, something to make you angry, something to fuel those passions. And we've seen the same thing happening in Egypt now, for example, where there was a rush of tweeting and blogging and writing and films and extraordinary celebration at the time of the revolution. And now, one of Khalid Abdullah, you may know him as a prominent actor. He was in the flight from 39. He was saying that, they should have an organization called Revolutionaries Anonymous, like Alcoholics Anonymous, because they're all sort of sitting around missing the revolution. So there is something quite inspiring.
And so where has the mic traveled to now?
Sir, I have a question for Sir Mohammed Hanif. You were given a lot of criticism on your second play, The Dictator's Wife. And I think a lot of people hated the fact that you also talked about Zia in the case of Exploding Mangoes. So do you do it because you love criticizing him, or do you love hating him, or do you actually want to touch a nerve for the public?
That's love. I think I must have an unhealthy obsession with dictators. Talking about resistance, I think one of the kind of best examples, one of the most complex, our kind of resistance anthem for years and years has been Faiz Saab's poem, Hum Dekhenge Jab Taj Uthale Jayenge. And, sort of, Musharraf bhi suna hai ki apne wahan baith ke wo bhi taaj uthala karta tha. To ekdam it was like this great kind of thing also. So sometimes the same text can, over the years can transform and become something else. Yeah.
My question is to Lyse, and I would think that with the passage of time there would be less propaganda. But what we witness is that even in the freest of the societies like US, there's so much propaganda that watching CNN sometimes makes me laugh. And the mainstream media. It's so funny that, when I was young, I used to believe that, America was a great country and they have the best media. And they've gone to Iraq to free the people and all that. Now you work for BBC. How much propaganda are you
so much applause. Not the kind of applause that one thinks that's actually a positive kind. Like you mentioned the BBC, that you said working for the BBC that I'm also dealing in propaganda, or
How much you face?
how much?
You face. How much propaganda do you
On
face?
BBC? Years. But because I've worked with the BBC for 30 years now, so you would say that I probably am not able to answer, because if there is propaganda, I'm perhaps totally brainwashed. But I can only say that just like all of you here in this room, you were colonized by the British. I'm Canadian, so I was colonized by both the British and the French. Disregard for my colonial imperial masters. One person's truth is another person's propaganda. All I can say is, I'm involved in an international broadcasting corporation who we do the best we can to try to get as close as possible to the truth of what happened. Although I have to say that in my journalistic career was when I was in Pakistan that I decided there actually wasn't something called truth. That even on who, what, when, where, why, we couldn't actually agree on it. So up to the viewer to decide. If you believe, and I'm sorry if you do, that much of what the BBC does is propaganda, then we have to do a better job of trying to describe the world as it is. I think my view on this is that the only way to try to describe the world as it is to speak to as many people as possible, with as many voices as possible. And somehow, you will never come to, it's what we say we write the first rough draft of history, and perhaps it's getting rougher and more of a draft and more hysterical than historical, but we do our best. On terms of the propaganda, we've talked about writers and poets and others, but there's also been a new form of writing in our generation, and that's spin doctors. And governments have discovered and have delighted in the fact that they also want to get into this information revolution that we've been talking about. They want to get their point of view across. They want to bypass the media and talk directly to people. And the best way to do that is by spinning a tale which is the approximation of the truth that they would like us to hear.
Thank you, Lyse. Now, as we are running out of time, we will try one last time to give Arundhati Roy her voice back.
Please, no one tell her that this happened, please.
Thank you so much for inviting me to the festival. I'm very sorry I couldn't come, so I hope this video will sort of work at least around the way there.
Is there a message that you'd like to give the festival protest?
Well, I know that I'm one of the writers who's sort of almost ritually associated with this whole idea of literature of protest. But I'm a little bit, I'm a little bit careful about that term, because we must ask, what are we protesting against? What are we protesting for? And so perhaps I will forward the idea of justice more. I mean, I know we have different ideas of justice, but protest runs the risk of becoming a new cool sort of middle class acquisition like an iPod or something. And we really ought to be a little more specific about that term, I think.
And you want to say something about what it means to be a writer in South Asia today?
That's a tough question. I think even though things are bad in India, it's probably easier to say what you think, even though it's not easy, but still, compared to what's happening in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, I think it's very, very difficult there, and in those places, and of course in Bangladesh as well, but it's becoming almost as bad here. There are rulers of the streets who are sort of imposing a kind of censorship, and there's all sorts of ways going on about it. How do we continue to say what we want? Sometimes we can't say it straight, so we have to find tangential ways of saying it. Very importantly, we have to survive in this atmosphere because, of course, there are people very eager to co-opt writers and take them into their protection and then use them as ammunition against their people in their communities. So I think it's very important for us to live here, to think here, and continue to be able to say what we want. Sometimes we have to find tricks, we have to find ways of saying it, sometimes we have to retreat, sometimes we have to move forward. It's not easy, but I think between us we have to find ways of managing because things are crowding in.
Thank you very much.
That is Arundhati Roy resisting the Lahore Literary Festival by not showing up. And thank you, Mohammed Hanif. Thank you, Lyse, thank you, Seima, Dabbagh. Thank you, Hasan.